are we?
We're in the beautiful Innsbruck in Austria, and we are checking out the old town. Beautiful stuff. Wow, look at this.
Пойдем, да.
Hey guys, it's Alec Torelli, and welcome to an episode of Ask Alec, where I take your questions on poker and life and answer them in 5 minutes or less. Today's question comes from Kaio. Really cool question here. He has actually a multitude of questions all about bet sizing in poker. So what I did is I'm going to create a little mini series about bet sizing. This is going to be an overview video about bet sizing in general, some things to consider, the factors that I use to make my decisions when deciding what and how much to bet. And in subsequent videos, I'm going to do bet sizing on small bets, big bets, medium bets, over bets, and also show you which bet sizing to use based on which types of hands that you have. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for further updates. In addition, the hand of the week this week, which comes out in 2 days, is going to be a hand of the day that has to do with bet sizing as well. That's one of the key concepts in my hand of the day of this week. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for updates as well. So Kaio's question is about, how to use bet sizing to maximize your value when playing poker, and also how to determine which bet sizing to use in general. That's his first question. So there's 4 factors that I really use to help determine what bet sizing I'm going to use in a hand. Number 1 is I always think about, what am I trying to accomplish? Do I want to extract value from my opponent? Do I want to milk him in the pot, or do I want to keep him in the pot? Do I want to force him to fold out of this hand? And I use that to start the basis of my decision, sort of the foundational aspect of what I'm trying to accomplish. Of course, if I'm trying to milk him in the pot, I might decide to bet smaller. If I'm trying to protect my hand because there's a lot of draws or my hand is very vulnerable, I might bet a lot bigger. One caveat to this that's extremely important that you utilize, because of course the advice I just gave you might sound a little rudimentary, the way to balance this or mix this up, I know balance is a word that you hear a lot in poker being thrown around these days, is that you don't only want to do what is your actual intention every single time. So for example, if you're trying to get value because you have a really strong hand, you don't want to always bet big. Sometimes what you want to do is bet small to balance the times that you're betting small on a bluff. So you want to balance your hands between betting really big when you have something good and also betting small when you have something good. In this way, your observant opponent can never figure out what exactly your intention is. So first you figure out your intention, then you construct the bet size that helps you achieve that intention. But in doing so, you also make sure that you're mixing up your play often enough that you're throwing your opponents for a loop. So sometimes you might actually do the opposite of your intention with your bet sizing to confuse them in the long term. The second thing that I consider when evaluating what bet sizing to use is, what is my opponent's equity in the pot? In other words, how well does their hand match up against mine specifically? So for example, if I'm in a spot where I'm either way ahead or way behind, for example, I have something like ace-king on an ace-9-2 board, I'm either dominating my opponent's hand, in other words, there's not that much equity that he has in the pot, or not that many cards can come that help his hand improve to one that is better than mine. The alternative is that he already has a hand that's better than mine, meaning he has a set of 9s, for example. In that case, there's pretty much no cards that could come that improve my hand to one that is better than his. This is a classic example of a time where you're either way ahead or way behind of your opponent's range. In situations like this, it's great to use bet sizing that is small, because you don't really accomplish a lot by betting big, and you don't really need to protect your hand against your opponent's range. If he has you beat, you're drawing dead. If you have him beat, he's drawing pretty close to dead, so you don't really need to bet too big. Other times, for example, if I have a very vulnerable hand, like 2 aces on a 10-9-6 with a flush draw board, you might want to consider betting bigger to protect your hand against your opponent's range. A lot of his holdings could have a lot of equity against your 2 aces. You might want to consider betting bigger. The third thing to consider with determining bet sizing that directly relates to the second one is, in addition to the second one, is your stack to pot ratio. Stack to pot ratio means the size of your stack relative to the pot. So for example, if you have $100 in your stack and the pot's 100, your stack size relative to the pot is 100 to 100 or 1 to 1. Also, if you have $200 stack, your stack to pot ratio is 200 to 100, 2 to 1. So the bigger your stack to pot ratio is, the more conservative you have to be, or the more cautious you have to be about betting bigger when your hand is vulnerable. That is because if your opponent does have you beat, you risk losing your entire stack. The reason that a lot of players prefer to play cash games is your stack to pot ratio is often a lot larger. Most of the time you have 100, 200, 300 big blinds. So your stack to pot ratio is always really, really, really high. This gives you more room to make decisions. Whereas in tournaments, let's say you have an average stack of 25, 35 big blinds, often you find yourself in a spot where you 3-bet pre-flop and get called, and suddenly your stack to pot ratio is 1. You don't really have many decisions post-flop. The only thing you could do is decide whether to go all in or fold, or check fold, or check call or something. You don't really have too many decisions at your disposal. So the bigger your stack to pot ratio is, the more cautious you have to be, the more conservative you have to be, the more options you have at your disposal, and the more creative you could be with how you want to play the hand. Here's an example. One thing I like to consider is, when determining my stack to pot ratio, is what I'm trying to accomplish in the specific hand. Do I want this hand to be a 2-street hand or a 3-street hand? In other words, when I'm deciding what size to bet, I think often about how my bet size on the flop is going to dictate the rest of the hand. So if I bet 50% of my stack on the flop, for example, this hand is never going to be a 3-street hand. In other words, it's going to get all in by the turn no matter what, or even on the flop, because I'm betting so big of a percentage of my stack. The alternative is, if I bet 10% of my stack on the flop, then I allow myself to bet 25% of my stack on the turn and 65% of my stack on the river. So I turn the hand into a 3-street hand. But this is done premeditatively, and it's done on the flop. By deciding how much you're going to bet on the flop, that amount compounds throughout the hand, and you sort of formulate a plan for how you want the hand to play out. Sometimes when I want it to be a 3-street hand, I'm either going for value, I'm trying to milk my opponents, or I'm trying to run a successful bluff. If I want it to be a 2-street hand, maybe I'm trying to get my opponents off the hand, or trying to punish their draws very, very quickly. So use these different metrics with your stack to pot ratio, and also formulating a plan for how many streets of action you want to accomplish in the hand to determine what bet sizing is best for you. The last thing to consider is really the difference between cash games and tournaments. This is important when determining your bet sizing as well. In cash games, you strictly want to focus on maximizing your EV. So for example, if the pot is 50,000 and you have 50,000 behind, your decision on whether or not to bet all in might only be influenced based on whether or not you can successfully bluff, if you're bluffing, or profitably value bet, if you're deciding whether or not to value bet. If you're in the same situation in a tournament where your stack is 50,000 and the pot is 50,000, another consideration that you might have, a deeper consideration, is it worth it to risk all the chips I have to gain more chips? There's a principle in tournaments that the incremental increase in chips that you gain doesn't increase proportionally to your stack. So as you gain more chips, your stack doesn't increase in value relative to the amount of chips you gain. It actually increases less in value. And opposite, when you lose chips, your stack decreases in value immensely because every chip you have is more important than the chip before it. So you might not want to risk value betting thinly in a spot where you have 50,000 behind and the pot's 50,000, because if you win, it only helps you a little bit, whereas if you lose, it helps you dramatically. So this might lead you to either consider checking behind or considering a smaller bet size, one that is much less risky and less detrimental if you were to value bet incorrectly and happen to lose. So these are the considerations I use when deciding when to bet and how much to bet. And in future videos, I'm going to discuss with you exactly what to do in specific situations. So I'll have a video on small bet sizing, a video on over bet sizing, and how to construct your hand range, how to figure out what your opponents are doing, and how to apply this situation directly to your game. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, stay tuned for further updates. If you have questions that you'd like answered on this show, and for more content that I only share over on my website, head over to my blog, alectorelli.com, and you'll see a ton more content over there on how to take your game to the next level. All right, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next week. Cheers.